The sound of her father's shotgun blast echoed through the night as Florence Sinclair fled across the moonlit prairie, her tears blinding her as she ran. She had endured his cruelty for 22 years, but tonight the night he had struck a deal to marry her off to a man 3 times her age for a parcel of land, she had finally found the courage to escape. The year was 1875, and the untamed Kansas territory offered little mercy to a woman alone. Florence's lungs burned as she stumbled through the tall grass, the hem of her dress tearing on brambles and her father's angry shouts growing fainter behind her. Another shot rang out, this one more distant, but it propelled her forward with renewed terror. She didn't see the ravine until it was too late. With a startled cry, Florence tumbled down the embankment, landing hard at the bottom. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing anew. This was it. Her father had mounted his horse and would drag her back to that house of misery, but the rider who appeared at the edge of the ravine wasn't her father. "Madam, you hurt." The voice was deep but gentle, belonging to a tall figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. He dismounted in one fluid motion, approaching cautiously. Florence pressed herself against the dirt wall of the ravine, clutching a rock in her trembling hand. "Stay back," she warned, her voice breaking. The stranger stopped, raising his hands slowly. "Not looking to harm you, madam. Name's Ethan Winters. I heard gunfire and came to investigate." As he stepped closer, moonlight revealed a man perhaps a few years older than herself, with kind eyes that contrasted sharply with the rugged lines of his face and the well-worn Stetson hat shadowing his features. Another distant shout, her father's voice, made Florence flinch. "That would be my father," she whispered. "He wants to drag me back and sell me like cattle to a man named Hargrove." Something hardened in Ethan's expression. Without another word, he extended his hand. "My horse is strong and fast. If you want to get away from here, I can help you." Florence hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. What choice did she have? Stay and be caught, or trust this stranger who appeared like a ghost in the night? "I promise I'll keep you safe," Ethan said as he helped her to her feet, steadying her when she winced at the pain in her ankle. "You have my word." It was a promise made by moonlight between strangers, a cowboy and a desperate woman, but as he lifted her onto his horse and mounted behind her, Florence felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The powerful horse carried them away from the ravine, across the open prairie, and into a future neither could have imagined just hours before. 3 days later, Florence sat by a small cooking fire outside a modest cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees. The property belonged to Ethan, who had explained he worked as a horse trainer for several ranches in the area, but kept this small homestead as his own. It was remote enough that her father wouldn't easily find them, Ethan had assured her. Her ankle, though bruised, wasn't broken after all, and Florence had spent the past days recovering while Ethan slept outside in a makeshift tent, insisting she take the cabin. It was a gentleman's gesture that had surprised her almost as much as his willingness to help a stranger. "How's the ankle today?" Ethan approached, carrying freshly caught fish for their dinner. Florence tested her weight on it and smiled. "Much better. I believe I'll be able to move on tomorrow." Ethan's expression faltered slightly as he knelt to prepare the fish. "Move on to where exactly?" The question hung in the air, and Florence realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. Her escape had been impulsive, born of desperate necessity rather than careful planning. "I have a cousin in Colorado," she said eventually, though it was a half-truth at best. The cousin existed, but they hadn't spoken in years, and Florence had no idea if she would be welcome. Ethan nodded slowly, his knife making quick work of the fish. "Colorado's a fair distance. Not a journey to make alone, especially with your father and possibly that Hargrove fellow looking for you." "I can't impose on your kindness any longer," Florence replied, though the thought of leaving the safety of this quiet grove filled her with dread. Ethan set down his knife and looked directly at her. "Miss Sinclair, I don't know your full story and you don't know mine, but I do know that a woman traveling alone faces dangers that would make your father seem like a mild inconvenience." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I have a proposition. I'm heading to Willow Creek in 2 days to deliver some horses. It's a small town about a week's ride from here, and they're always looking for a schoolteacher. With your fine speaking and writing, you'd be perfect for it." Florence stared at him, surprised both by the offer and that he had noticed her education. She had mentioned reading some of his books, but little else. "How do you know I can teach?" she asked. A small smile crossed his face. "The way you corrected my grammar yesterday without even thinking about it, and I saw how you reordered my bookshelf by subject and author. Not many folks out here care about such things." Heat rose to Florence's cheeks. "I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't," he interrupted gently. "Truth is, Miss Sinclair, Willow Creek could use someone like you, and until you're settled there, I'd consider it my duty to ensure you're safe." Florence studied him, trying to understand his motivation. In her experience, men rarely offered help without expecting something in return. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Winters? You don't know me." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, turning back to his task of preparing the fish. "My sister ran away from a similar situation 5 years ago," he finally said, his voice low. "No one helped her. She didn't survive the winter." He looked up, his eyes reflecting the pain of that memory. "I couldn't help her then, but I can help you now." The simple honesty in his words touched something deep within Florence. She had spent years building walls against a world that had shown her little kindness. But this man, this stranger who had become her protector, was offering her not just safety but a future. "Willow Creek," she said softly, testing the name. "Do you think they would truly accept me there?" A woman with no references, no history, Ethan nodded. "It's a new settlement. Most folks there are starting fresh themselves. No one asks too many questions about where you came from, only what you can contribute." Florence took a deep breath, considering. She had no better plan, and the thought of traveling alone terrified her. "Very well, Mr. Winters. I accept your offer to escort me to Willow Creek." His smile was genuine, warming his features in a way that made Florence quickly look away. Suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation, a single woman and man alone in the wilderness. But conventional propriety seemed a distant concern compared to survival. "We'll leave at first light the day after tomorrow," Ethan said, returning to his preparations. "And Miss Sinclair, you might want to start calling me Ethan. Where we're going, formality isn't as important as friendship." "Then you must call me Florence," she replied, surprised at how natural it felt to offer this small intimacy. As the fish cooked over the open flame and the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, Florence felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, not quite peace, but perhaps its precursor. Possibility. The journey to Willow Creek proved more arduous than Florence had anticipated. They traveled mainly at dawn and dusk to avoid the brutal midday sun, with Ethan leading 4 horses he'd been commissioned to deliver. Florence rode a gentle mare Ethan called Daisy, while he alternated between the other horses to train them for the journey. On their 3rd night, camped beside a small creek, a summer storm blew in with startling ferocity. The rain pelted their makeshift camp, and despite Ethan's quick work to construct a shelter from canvas and branches, they were both soaked through within minutes. "We need to find better cover." Ethan shouted over the thunder, gathering their few possessions. "There's a rock outcropping half a mile ahead. It might provide shelter." Leading the nervous horses, they made their way through the downpour. By the time they reached the natural stone formation, Florence was shivering uncontrollably, her dress clinging to her like a second skin. The outcropping created a shallow cave, just deep enough to shield them and the horses from the worst of the storm. Ethan worked quickly, unloading their necessities and creating a barrier with their canvas to block the wind. "You're freezing," he observed, concern evident in his voice. "We need to get you warm." Florence nodded, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. Propriety demanded distance, but survival required warmth. Ethan built a small fire near the mouth of their shelter where the smoke could escape. Then, with obvious hesitation, he removed his relatively dry coat from one of the sealed packs and handed it to her. "You should change out of those wet clothes," he said, turning his back to give her privacy. "I'll keep watch outside for a moment." The storm, Florence began to protest. "I'll stay just under the edge," he assured her. "You need to get dry, Florence. Pneumonia out here would be deadly." She couldn't argue with that logic. When he stepped out, she quickly peeled off her soaked dress and undergarments, using a semi-dry portion of her blanket to towel herself before pulling on her spare chemise and wrapping herself in Ethan's coat. The garment enveloped her in his scent leather, pine, and something distinctly masculine that made her heart beat a little faster. "I'm decent," she called after a moment. Ethan returned, his own clothes plastered to his broad shoulders and chest. Droplets of water clung to his eyelashes and the stubble that had grown during their journey. Florence found herself staring before quickly averting her gaze. "Your turn," she said, gesturing to his pack. "You need dry clothes as well," he nodded, retrieving his spare clothing. This time, Florence was the one to step toward the entrance, keeping her back firmly turned while she listened to the rustle of fabric that indicated he was changing. The intimacy of the moment, two virtual strangers sharing such close quarters, was not lost on her. When she turned back, Ethan had changed into dry trousers and a shirt, though his hair still dripped onto his shoulders. He had added wood to the fire, which now cast a warm glow throughout their small sanctuary. "Better?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. Florence nodded, pulling his coat tighter around her. "Thank you." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside while their clothes dried on rocks near the fire. "May I ask you something personal?" Florence finally ventured, watching embers float upward into the darkness. Ethan looked up, his expression open. "Of course. You mentioned your sister, but what about the rest of your family? Do you have one waiting somewhere?" A shadow crossed his face. "No, my parents died when I was 16. It was just my sister and me after that. When she..." His voice trailed off. "I've been on my own for a while now." Florence recognized the grief in his voice. It mirrored her own when she thought about her mother, who had died when Florence was 12, leaving her alone with a father who grew more bitter and controlling with each passing year. "My mother used to say that some people carry their homes in their hearts," she said softly. "That even when you lose everyone, you never truly lose the love they gave you." Ethan's eyes, reflecting the firelight, studied her face. "Your mother sounds like she was wise." "She was," Florence agreed. "She taught me to read, to appreciate beauty in small things. My father..." She hesitated, the familiar knot of anger and pain tightening in her chest. "He changed after she died. The kindness went out of him. All that remained was his determination to control everything around him, especially me." "Is that why you ran?" Ethan asked gently. Florence nodded, staring into the fire. "He arranged a marriage for me to Gerald Hargrove, a man of 60 who owns the adjoining property. A man known for burying 2 wives already." She shuddered at the memory. "When I refused, my father locked me in my room and said the wedding would proceed in 3 days, willing or not. That night I climbed out the window." Ethan's jaw tightened. "No father worthy of the name would do that to his daughter." "He hasn't been worthy of the name for many years," Florence replied, surprised at how easily the words came now, after years of silence and shame. Outside, the storm was beginning to abate, the thunder now a distant rumble rather than the deafening crashes of before. The rhythm of the rain gentled to a steady patter. "What about you?" Florence asked, wanting to shift the focus from her own painful memories. "How did you come to be a horse trainer living alone in the wilderness?" A slight smile touched Ethan's lips. "I've always had a way with horses. After my sister died, I couldn't bear to stay in our hometown. Too many memories, too many pitying looks. So I headed west with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back." He gestured toward the animals sheltering at the far end of their makeshift camp. "Turns out people will pay good money for someone who can gentle a wild horse without breaking its spirit." There was something in the way he said it, gentle without breaking, that resonated with Florence. It spoke of a fundamental respect for life that she found profoundly moving. "And the cabin?" she prompted. "Won it in a card game 3 years ago," he admitted with a sheepish grin that transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "Only bit of gambling I've ever done. The previous owner was headed to California and had no use for it anymore." Florence couldn't help but smile in return. "Lucky hand." "I'm beginning to think so," Ethan replied, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Florence felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked away first, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how intimate this conversation had become. "We should try to get some rest," she suggested, her voice slightly unsteady. "If the rain stops by morning, we'll want an early start." Ethan nodded. arranging his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance that Florence found both reassuring and oddly disappointing. "Good night, Florence," he said quietly as he settled down. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, wrapping herself in her blanket and his coat, which she found herself reluctant to remove. As she drifted towards sleep, lulled by the gentle rain and the soft breathing of the man across the fire, Florence realized that for the first time in years she felt not just safe, but seen. Ethan Winters had looked at her and recognized not just a woman in distress, but a person with thoughts, feelings, and dreams of her own. It was, she thought as sleep claimed her, a dangerous sort of gift to give someone who had learned long ago not to expect kindness from the world. The remaining days of their journey passed more quickly than Florence expected. Each evening around the campfire, they shared more of themselves, stories of childhood, books they had read, dreams they had harbored. Florence found herself laughing more than she had in years, especially when Ethan recounted tales of his more challenging horses or mishaps from his early days as a trainer. "I once spent 3 hours chasing a mare who stole my only hat," he told her on their 5th night, demonstrating with exaggerated gestures how he had lunged repeatedly for the prized Stetson while the horse pranced just out of reach. "When I finally got it back, it had been thoroughly chewed and was missing half the brim." Florence laughed until tears came to her eyes, imagining the dignified man before her engaged in such an undignified pursuit. She was startled by the sound of her own laughter. It had been so long since genuine mirth had bubbled up from within her. Ethan watched her with a warm expression that made her cheeks heat. "You have a beautiful laugh," he said simply. The compliment caught her off guard. "I'm sorry, don't apologize," he interrupted gently. "Not for joy. There's precious little of it in this world." Florence nodded, feeling an unexpected tightness in her throat. How strange that this man, who had been a stranger just days ago, now seemed to understand parts of her that she had kept hidden for so long. On the morning of the 7th day, they crested a hill to find Willow Creek spread out before them, a small but thriving settlement nestled in a verdant valley. From their vantage point, Florence could see a church steeple, a main street lined with businesses, and scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding countryside. "It's larger than I expected," she admitted, taking in the scene with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "It's grown considerably in the past year," Ethan explained. "The railroad's coming through next spring, so people are settling ahead of it." He pointed toward a white building near the church. "That's the schoolhouse. Last I heard, the teacher left to get married 2 months ago." Florence straightened her spine, smoothing down her travel-worn dress as best she could. After a week on the trail, she was painfully aware of her disheveled appearance. "Do I look presentable enough to apply for a teaching position?" Ethan's gaze traveled over her, and something in his expression made Florence's heart flutter. "You look fine," he said, his voice a touch deeper than usual, "but we should get you settled at the boarding house first. Mrs. Peterson runs a respectable place where you can clean up and rest before meeting with the town council." Florence nodded, grateful for his guidance. As they began their descent into the valley, she was struck by a sudden realization that their journey was ending. Soon, Ethan would deliver his horses and continue on his way, while she would remain here to build a new life. The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. The town of Willow Creek proved to be as welcoming as Ethan had promised. Mrs. Peterson, a plump widow with a no-nonsense manner, took one look at Florence's travel-worn appearance and ushered her immediately to a hot bath, declaring that any friend of Ethan Winters is welcome under my roof. The luxury of clean water and soap after a week on the trail was almost overwhelming. As Florence sank into the tub, she found herself wondering about Ethan's connection to this town and its people. They clearly knew and respected him, yet he lived alone in his remote cabin. It was just one of many contradictions she had observed in the quiet Cowboy. Dressed in her cleanest remaining dress, and with her hair properly arranged, Florence felt like herself again when she descended to the boarding house parlor. Ethan was waiting, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. For a moment they simply looked at each other, both transformed from their trail-worn selves. "You look," Ethan began, then seemed to lose his train of thought. "Cleaner." Florence suggested with a small smile. His answering smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. I was going to say beautiful, but cleaner works too. The compliment sent warmth flooding through her. Before she could respond, Mrs. Peterson bustled in, announcing that the chairman of the school board was eager to meet Florence and had invited them to dinner that evening. I sent word as soon as you arrived, the older woman explained. We've been desperate for a teacher since Miss Harper left. Half the children in town are running wild, and the other half are being taught all wrong by their mothers. I haven't even applied for the position yet, Florence protested weakly. Mrs. Peterson waved away her concern. Judge Barnes is chairman of the school board. Consider dinner your interview. She turned to Ethan. You'll accompany her, of course. The judge specifically asked for you both. Ethan looked to Florence, raising an eyebrow in silent question. She nodded, relieved that their parting would be delayed at least until after dinner. Judge Barnes proved to be a jovial man in his 50s with a genuine passion for education. His home, one of the largest in Willow Creek, was filled with books, a sight that immediately endeared him to Florence. Miss Sinclair, Ethan tells me you're well educated and looking for a fresh start, the judge said once they were seated at his dining table. His wife, a gracious woman with silver-streaked dark hair, served a meal far more refined than anything Florence had eaten in weeks. I was fortunate to receive extensive schooling from my mother, who was a teacher before her marriage, Florence replied honestly, and I've always loved learning, but I haven't taught formally before. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Formal experience matters less than knowledge and a genuine desire to teach. Our school has 27 pupils ranging from 5 to 16 years of age. It's a challenging position, but a vital one for our community. Florence has a way of explaining complex ideas simply, Ethan interjected, surprising her with his support. And she's patient. I've seen her spend an hour helping a butterfly with a damaged wing. Florence looked at him, touched that he had noticed such a small moment during their journey. That patience will serve you well with some of our more spirited children, Mrs. Barnes said with a knowing smile. Would you be willing to provide a demonstration of your teaching abilities tomorrow, perhaps a short lesson for a few of the children? I would be happy to, Florence agreed, though butterflies fluttered in her stomach at the prospect. The conversation flowed easily through dinner, covering topics from literature to town politics. Florence found herself relaxing, genuinely enjoying the intellectual exchange. When Judge Barnes invited Ethan to his study for a cigar, leaving Florence with Mrs. Barnes, she realized this was the first time she and Ethan had been separated since her escape. Ethan speaks very highly of you, Mrs. Barnes said as she poured tea, and he's not a man who offers praise lightly. Florence felt her cheeks warm. We met under unusual circumstances. He's been exceedingly kind. The older woman's perceptive eyes studied her. Kindness is his nature, but there's more than kindness in the way he looks at you, my dear. Unsure how to respond to such a direct observation, Florence focused on her teacup. We've known each other only a week, Mrs. Barnes. Sometimes a week is all it takes to recognize something special, the woman replied with a gentle smile. My husband proposed to me after knowing me for 5 days. That was 32 years ago. Before Florence could formulate a response, the men returned from the study, and Judge Barnes announced that he had arranged for Florence to meet with several school-aged children the following morning. As Ethan escorted her back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Florence found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his footsteps, the slight brush of his arm against hers when the path narrowed. You made quite an impression on the judge, Ethan observed. I wouldn't be surprised if he offers you the position after your demonstration tomorrow. Thanks in no small part to your endorsement, Florence replied. You didn't have to speak on my behalf. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. I only spoke the truth, Florence. You'll make an excellent teacher. The certainty in his voice bolstered her confidence. And what about you? Will you stay in Willow Creek for a while or continue on after delivering the horses? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. I plan to return to my cabin, he admitted, but plans can change. Florence's heart quickened at his words and the intensity in his gaze. Mrs. Barnes seems to think you have reasons to stay, she said, surprised by her own boldness. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Mrs. Barnes has been trying to marry me off to some local girl for years. Oh, Florence looked away, suddenly embarrassed. Of course, Ethan's hand gently caught her chin, turning her face back toward his. I've never been tempted to stay before, he said softly. They stood there, suspended in a moment of possibility until the distant closing of a door broke the spell. Florence stepped back, conscious of their public location and her precarious position as a newcomer to town. I should rest before tomorrow, she said, her voice not quite steady. Ethan nodded, respecting her withdrawal. I'll come by in the morning to escort you to the school. At the boarding house door, he tipped his hat in a formal gesture that somehow felt more intimate than the moment they had shared on the street. Good night, Florence, he said, his voice low. Sleep well. Good night, Ethan, she replied, watching him walk away before closing the door. Inside her room, Florence sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts whirling. In just over a week, her life had transformed completely from captive daughter to potential schoolteacher, from isolation to connection. And at the center of this transformation stood Ethan Winters, a man whose quiet strength and unexpected tenderness had awakened feelings she had long since buried. Tomorrow, she would face the challenge of proving herself to the town. But tonight, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with the cowboy who had rescued her, and she had no idea if their paths would continue together or diverge after tomorrow. Morning brought both anticipation and anxiety as Florence prepared for her teaching demonstration. She donned her best dress, a navy blue cotton with minimal adornment, and arranged her hair in a simple but neat style. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror appeared composed, but Florence's stomach fluttered with nerves. A knock at the boarding house door announced Ethan's arrival. When Mrs. Peterson showed him into the parlor, Florence was struck anew by his presence. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and vest, his usually tousled hair tamed. You look ready to take on the world, he said, his eyes warm with approval. I'll settle for impressing a few children and their parents, Florence replied with a nervous smile. The walk to the schoolhouse gave Florence time to collect her thoughts. Judge Barnes had arranged for 6 children of varying ages to attend her demonstration, along with their parents and several members of the school board. What will you teach them? Ethan asked as they approached the white clapboard building. Florence had considered this question most of the night. Natural science, she decided. It's a subject that engages children of all ages, and I can incorporate reading, arithmetic, and observation skills. Ethan nodded approvingly. Practical knowledge that serves them well on the frontier. The schoolhouse was a single large room with rows of simple wooden desks facing a teacher's desk and blackboard. When Florence entered, she found 12 adults and 6 children waiting expectantly. Judge Barnes made introductions, and Florence was pleased to see that the children, though clearly curious about her, appeared eager to learn. Taking a deep breath, she stepped to the front of the room. Good morning. Today, we're going to explore the natural world around us, beginning with something you see every day but perhaps haven't examined closely. From her pocket, she withdrew several leaves she had collected that morning from trees near the boarding house. She distributed them among the children. I'd like each of you to study your leaf carefully. Count the veins, measure its length and width using the rulers on your desks, and note anything special about its shape or color. The simplicity of the task allowed children of different ages to participate according to their abilities. The youngest, a girl of about 6, counted the veins with careful precision, while the oldest boy, around 14, created a detailed sketch with measurements. Florence moved among them, asking questions and offering guidance. When they had finished their observations, she used the blackboard to show how their findings could be organized into tables, introducing basic principles of classification and arithmetic. Now, she said, drawing their attention back to her, these leaves come from different trees that grow right here in Willow Creek. Who can tell me why trees need leaves? This launched a lively discussion about plants, sunlight, and the changing seasons. Florence seamlessly incorporated reading by having the older children help the younger ones find information in a nature book Judge Barnes had provided. Throughout the lesson, she was acutely aware of Ethan watching from the back of the room, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper that made her pulse quicken whenever their eyes met. By the end of the hour-long demonstration, even the most restless child was engaged, and the adults were exchanging approving glances. When Florence concluded by having each child share one new thing they had learned, the enthusiasm in their responses confirmed she had succeeded. Judge Barnes stepped forward, beaming. "I think I speak for the entire school board when I say that was most impressive, Miss Sinclair. Would you mind stepping outside with us to discuss the position further?" As the children were collected by their parents, many of whom stopped to compliment Florence on the lesson, Ethan approached. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "You have a gift." His sincere admiration meant more to her than all the other compliments combined. "Thank you for believing I could do this," she replied. Outside, the school board's discussion was brief and unanimous. Judge Barnes officially offered Florence the position of schoolteacher for Willow Creek, with a salary that included room and board in a small cottage adjacent to the school. "The previous teacher lived there," he explained. "It's modest but comfortable, and being so close to the school is convenient. If you accept, you could move in today and begin classes next Monday." Florence could hardly believe how quickly everything was falling into place. "I accept with gratitude," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. As the board members dispersed, Florence found herself alone with Ethan once more. The reality that she now had a position, a home, and a future in Willow Creek suddenly highlighted the uncertainty of their relationship. "I should see this cottage," she said, filling the silence that had fallen between them. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll walk with you." The teacher's cottage proved to be a charming one-room structure with a small kitchen area, a bed, a writing desk, and bookshelves built into the walls. Simple but clean curtains framed the windows, and a braided rug covered part of the wooden floor. "It's perfect," Florence said, turning slowly to take it all in. After years under her father's roof and a week sleeping under the stars, this modest space represented freedom and possibility. "It suits you," Ethan agreed, standing in the doorway as if hesitant to enter what was now her home. Florence faced him, suddenly acutely aware that their journey together had reached its intended destination. "I suppose you'll be leaving soon," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Ethan stepped inside, closing the distance between them. "That depends," he said, his voice low. "On what?" "On whether there's a reason for me to stay." Florence's heart hammered in her chest. "What reason would be compelling enough to change your plans?" Ethan took another step closer. "You know the answer to that, Florence." The directness of his gaze left no room for pretense. In the past week, something had grown between them, something neither had anticipated but both now acknowledged. "I've known you such a short time," Florence whispered, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Ethan replied, echoing Mrs. Barnes's words from the previous evening. "I've wandered for years, Florence. But from the moment I found you in that ravine, something changed. I can't explain it, but I know I don't want to leave you behind." Florence's breath caught. "What are you saying, Ethan?" He took her hands in his touch gentle yet sure. "I'm saying that if you want me to go, I'll go. But if you want me to stay to see where this leads, then I'll find reasons to be in Willow Creek as long as it takes for us to be certain." The honesty in his words moved her deeply. This was not a declaration of undying love, they knew each other too little for that, but rather an acknowledgement of potential, of a beginning worth exploring. "I don't want you to go," Florence admitted, her voice barely audible. "These past days with you have been. I've never felt so seen, so understood." Relief and joy transformed Ethan's expression. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he raised one hand to cup her cheek. "May I?" he asked softly. Florence nodded, her eyes closing as he leaned in. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepened with a warmth that spread through her entire body. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and Florence found herself responding with an intensity that surprised them both. When they finally parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I'll need to deliver these horses and collect payment," he said, "but I could be back within 2 weeks. Judge Barnes mentioned the livery stable is looking for someone who knows horses." Florence smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. 2 weeks, she agreed. "I'll have plenty to keep me busy until then." The sound of approaching footsteps outside the cottage reminded them of their public setting. Ethan stepped back reluctantly, though his eyes remained fixed on hers. "Miss Sinclair," Mrs. Peterson's voice called, "I've brought some linens for your new home." Florence smoothed her dress, trying to compose herself before responding. "Please come in, Mrs. Peterson." The older woman entered, arms laden with bedding, her knowing eyes taking in the situation with one sweeping glance. If she noticed the heightened color in Florence's cheeks or Ethan's slightly disheveled appearance, she gave no indication. "This cottage has stood empty too long," she declared, setting down her burden. "We'll have it properly furnished by nightfall. The ladies of the church are already gathering household items for you." The community's generosity overwhelmed Florence. "That's incredibly kind," she managed, Mrs. Peterson waved away her thanks. "It's practical. We need our teacher comfortable and settled." She turned to Ethan with a pointed look. "I assume you'll be heading out with those horses soon." "Tomorrow morning," he confirmed. "I've arrangements to make at the livery first." The knowing gleam in Mrs. Peterson's eye suggested she understood exactly what arrangements Ethan was planning. "Well then, I'll expect you for supper tonight, Miss Sinclair. No sense cooking in a new kitchen your first night." After she departed, Florence and Ethan exchanged amused glances. "I believe the town gossip will begin immediately," Florence observed. "Does that concern you?" Ethan asked, suddenly serious. Florence considered the question. In her father's house, such talk would have been disastrous. But here, in this new beginning she was crafting for herself, the opinions of others seemed less important than her own heart's direction. "No," she decided. "Let them talk. We know the truth of what's between us, that we're taking time to discover it properly." Ethan's smile returned, warming his features. "Then I should help you get settled before I make those arrangements at the livery. 2 weeks will pass quickly." As they unpacked her few belongings and accepted the steady stream of household items delivered by townspeople throughout the afternoon, Florence felt a surety growing within her. Whatever happened next, she had found not just safety but possibility in Willow Creek and in the quiet cowboy who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer on the darkest night of her life. The 2 weeks of Ethan's absence passed both more quickly and more slowly than Florence expected. Her days were filled with preparations for the school term, organizing textbooks, planning lessons, and meeting her future pupils as they came with their parents to introduce themselves. The townspeople welcomed her warmly, inviting her to Sunday services and community gatherings, eager to incorporate their new teacher into the fabric of Willow Creek. Nights were different. In the quiet solitude of her cottage, Florence found her thoughts invariably turning to Ethan, his gentle strength, his quiet humor, the feeling of his lips on hers. She wondered where he was each evening, whether he was thinking of her, whether the connection they had felt was strong enough to bring him back to a town where he had never before chosen to settle. On the morning marking 2 weeks since his departure, Florence was arranging books on the schoolroom shelves when she heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leapt, but she forced herself to continue her task, not wanting to appear as though she had been counting the days. The schoolhouse door opened, sending a shaft of sunlight across the wooden floor. Florence turned, a book still in her hands, to find Ethan standing in the doorway. He looked trail-worn but somehow more handsome than she remembered, his Stetson in his hands and uncertainty in his eyes. "You came back," she said simply, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I said I would," he replied, stepping into the schoolroom. His gaze traveled over her, taking in the practical dress and apron she wore for her work, her hair neatly pinned back. "You look like you belong here." "I'm beginning to feel that way," Florence admitted, setting down the book and moving toward him. "How was your journey?" "Long," he said with feeling, "but profitable and educational." "Educational," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. A smile tugged at his lips. "I had a lot of time to think. About my life, about what I want." He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "About you," Florence's breath caught. "And what conclusions did you reach during all this thinking?" "That I've been wandering long enough," Ethan said softly. "That maybe it's time to build something lasting." Before Florence could respond, he continued, "I spoke with Sam Jenkins at the livery. He's offered me a partnership, my experience with horses and his business sense. It would mean staying in Willow Creek permanently." Hope bloomed in Florence's chest. "And is that what you want?" Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "What I want is to court you properly, Florence Sinclair, to see if what began between us on the trail can grow into something enduring." The simple honesty of his declaration moved her deeply. "I would like that very much," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. His smile was radiant as he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles in a gesture both gallant and intimate. "Then I'll call on you tomorrow evening, if I may. Perhaps we could walk by the creek after supper." "I'll look forward to it," Florence said, reluctantly releasing his hand as the sound of approaching children signaled the end of their private moment. Ethan settled his hat back on his head, the uncertainty gone from his eyes, replaced by a warmth that made Florence's heart race. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Sinclair," he said, loud enough for the entering children to hear. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Winters," she replied formally, though the look they exchanged was anything but formal. As Ethan departed and Florence turned her attention to the curious children, she felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The path that had begun in terror on a moonlit prairie was leading somewhere she had never dared to imagine, toward happiness, toward home, toward love. The courtship of Florence Sinclair and Ethan Winters became the talk of Willow Creek that autumn. They were often seen walking together in the evenings, sometimes along the creek that gave the town its name, other times among the shops on Main Street. On Sundays, they sat together in church, their matching expressions of contentment noted by many observant townspeople. Florence's position as the schoolteacher gave her standing in the community, and her gentle manner and educational innovations quickly endeared her to both parents and children. Meanwhile, Ethan's partnership with Sam Jenkins breathed new life into the livery stable, attracting business from surrounding homesteads and passing travelers alike. By the Harvest Festival in late October, 3 months after Florence's arrival in Willow Creek, no one was surprised to see Ethan escort her to the community celebration, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. "You've transformed this town," Ethan murmured as they watched children competing in sack races, their shrieks of laughter filling the crisp autumn air. Florence glanced up at him, puzzled. "I've only taught a few dozen children their letters and numbers." Ethan shook his head, his expression tender. "You've done far more than that. You've brought joy and curiosity where there was only rote learning before. These children adore you, and so do their parents." Florence felt warmth rise to her cheeks at his praise. "And what about you, Mr. Winters? Have I transformed you as well?" His gaze turned serious as he led her away from the crowds, toward a quieter area beneath a large oak tree whose leaves had turned golden in the autumn light. "More than you know," he said softly. "Before you came into my life, I was just existing. Moving from place to place, never putting down roots, never allowing myself to imagine a future beyond the next job. And now," Florence prompted when he paused, "now I find myself planning, building, dreaming." He took both her hands in his. "Florence, these past months have been the happiest of my life. Every day I spend with you confirms what I began to suspect that first night on the trail, that you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known." Florence's heart hammered in her chest as Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. When he knelt before her, unmindful of the festival goers who had begun to notice and nudge one another, she felt tears spring to her eyes. "Florence Sinclair," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression, "I promised to keep you safe that night we met, but what I've found with you is so much more than safety. It's joy, it's purpose, it's love." He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful gold ring set with a small diamond. "Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Florence was transported back to that night 3 months ago, terrified, fleeing from a forced marriage with no hope for her future. How different this proposal was, born of mutual respect, genuine affection, and a love that had grown steadily with each passing day. "Yes," she whispered, then louder so that he could hear over the murmurs of the gathering crowd, "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he rose and slipped the ring onto her finger. When he gathered her into his arms and kissed her, the onlookers erupted in cheers and applause, but Florence barely heard them. In that moment, there was only Ethan and the promise of a future together. Later, As they received congratulations from what seemed like the entire town, Judge Barnes approached with a broad smile. "I knew that first day when Ethan spoke so highly of you during your teaching demonstration that we'd be attending your wedding before the year was out," he declared, pumping Ethan's hand enthusiastically. "Am I that transparent?" Ethan asked with a laugh. "Only to those with eyes, Mrs." Barnes replied with a knowing smile. "Now, have you set a date?" Florence and Ethan exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed specifics yet, but Florence found herself saying, "Perhaps Christmas. I've always thought a winter wedding would be lovely." "Christmas it is," Ethan agreed immediately, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want to wait any longer than necessary." The news of their engagement and planned Christmas wedding spread quickly through Willow Creek. The ladies of the town immediately began organizing, with Mrs. Peterson taking charge of the wedding preparations and Mrs. Barnes offering the use of her home for the reception. As the first snows of winter dusted Willow Creek in early December, Florence found herself busier than ever. Between teaching her students, preparing for the end-of-term examinations, and addressing wedding details, she hardly had a moment to herself. Yet she had never been happier. One evening, as she and Ethan sat before the fire in her cottage, discussing their plans for after the wedding, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Florence opened it to find Mrs. Peterson standing there, an envelope in her hand and concern on her face. "This just arrived by special messenger," the older woman said, extending the envelope. "The man who delivered it said it was urgent." Florence took the envelope with a puzzled frown. Her name was written on the front in an unfamiliar hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," she said, closing the door as the woman reluctantly departed. "Who would be sending you urgent messages?" Ethan asked, standing to join her. Florence broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. As she read, the color drained from her face. "What is it?" Ethan asked, alarmed by her reaction. "It's from Gerald Hargrove," Florence whispered, her voice shaking. "The man my father tried to force me to marry. He says my father is gravely ill and asking for me. He claims my father has had a change of heart and wants to make amends before he dies." Ethan's expression darkened. "It could be a trap," he said, taking the letter and scanning it. "This Hargrove could be working with your father to lure you back." "That's possible," Florence agreed, her mind racing. "But what if it's true? What if my father really is dying and wants forgiveness?" Despite years of mistreatment, the thought of her father dying alone, asking for her, stirred complicated emotions within her. Ethan studied her face, his own conflicted. "You're considering going, aren't you?" "I don't know," Florence admitted. "Part of me wants nothing more to do with either of them, but another part." She trailed off, unable to articulate the mixture of duty, curiosity, and lingering attachment she felt. "If you decide to go, I'm coming with you," Ethan said firmly. "I won't let you face them alone." Florence looked up at him, gratitude and love overwhelming her. "It would mean delaying our wedding preparations, and the journey there and back would take at least 2 weeks. "The wedding can wait if necessary," Ethan replied without hesitation. "Your peace of mind is more important." After a night of discussion and soul-searching, Florence made her decision. She would return to her father's home with Ethan by her side to discover the truth. If her father genuinely sought reconciliation, she would offer forgiveness. If it was a ruse, she would finally confront both men and close that chapter of her life for good. Judge Barnes agreed to find a substitute teacher for the final weeks of the term, and Sam Jenkins assured Ethan that he could manage the livery in his absence. 3 days after receiving the letter, Florence and Ethan set out on horseback, retracing in reverse the journey that had first brought them together. As familiar landmarks appeared, Florence found herself growing increasingly tense. Ethan, riding beside her, noticed her anxiety and reached across to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "Whatever happens," he promised, "we face it together, and when it's done, we return to Willow Creek and the life we're building." His words steadied her, a reminder that whatever lay ahead at her father's farm, it was her past, not her future. Her future belonged to her and Ethan in the community that had embraced them both. They arrived at the outskirts of her father's property on a cold, clear afternoon. From a distance, the farmhouse looked much as it always had, though perhaps more neglected than Florence remembered. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was in residence. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked as they paused at the property line. Florence took a deep breath and nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. They rode up the long drive together, side by side. As they approached the house, the front door opened, and Gerald Hargrove stepped onto the porch. He was exactly as Florence remembered, a tall, skeletal man with cold eyes and a permanent downturn to his mouth. Seeing him again sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Miss Sinclair," Hargrove called, his voice as unpleasant as his appearance. "How good of you to come, and I see you've brought company." His gaze lingered on Ethan with evident disapproval. "This is Ethan Winters, my fiancé," Florence replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Where is my father?" Hargrove's eyebrows rose at the word fiancé, but he merely gestured toward the house. "Inside. He's been confined to bed these past weeks. The doctor doesn't give him long." Florence dismounted, Ethan close behind her. As they approached the porch, Ethan placed a protective hand at the small of her back, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by Hargrove. "Your father requested to speak with you alone," Hargrove said, blocking their path. The presence of a stranger might agitate him in his delicate condition. "Mr. Winters stays with me," Florence stated firmly. "Those are my terms." Hargrove's mouth tightened, but after a moment's consideration he stepped aside. "Very well, but don't blame me if the shock hastens his end." The interior of the house was much as Florence remembered, though dustier and more disordered than it had been during her time there. Her father had never been one for housekeeping after her mother died, but the current state suggested genuine neglect. Hargrove led them to the bedroom at the back of the house. "He's in and out of consciousness," he warned before opening the door. "Sometimes lucid, sometimes not." Florence steeled herself before entering. The man in the bed bore little resemblance to the towering figure who had dominated her childhood. Calvin Sinclair had always been robust, intimidating in his physical presence. Now he was wasted, his skin yellowed and drawn tight over his bones, his breathing labored. "Father," Florence said softly, approaching the bed. The old man's eyelids fluttered, then opened. For a moment there was no recognition in his gaze, then his eyes focused on her face. "Florence?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "You came." "I came," she confirmed, standing at the bedside but not touching him. "Who's that?" her father demanded, his gaze shifting to Ethan, who stood protectively at Florence's side. "This is Ethan Winters, my fiancé," Florence explained, lifting her chin slightly in anticipation of her father's disapproval. To her surprise, Calvin Sinclair merely nodded weakly. Good that you're not alone." His eyes drifted closed, then opened again with visible effort. "Hargrove said he'd find you, didn't think you'd come." "Your letter said you wanted to make amends," Florence said, careful to keep accusation from her tone. "Is that true?" Her father's sunken chest rose and fell with a labored breath. "Did wrong by you," he mumbled, "after your mother. Lost my way, became something I wasn't meant to be." Florence felt Ethan's hand on her shoulder, lending her strength as emotions threatened to overwhelm her. This admission, however feeble, was more than she had ever expected from her proud, unyielding father. "Why did you send Hargrove to find me?" she asked. "After what you tried to force," a ghost of a smile touched her father's cracked lips. "Didn't send him. He came on his own after I took ill, still thinks he has a claim on you." His eyes, suddenly more lucid, fixed on hers. "You're free of him." "Free of me, that's good." Florence felt tears welling in her eyes, not for the man her father had become after her mother's death, but for the father he had once been, and for the recognition, however late, of the wrong he had done her. "I forgive you," she said softly, the words coming more easily than she had expected. "Don't deserve it," her father replied, his voice fading, "but thank you." His gaze shifted to Ethan. "You take care of her." "With my life," Ethan promised solemnly. Calvin Sinclair nodded once, then closed his eyes. For a moment, Florence thought he had slipped away, but the shallow rise and fall of his chest continued. "He needs rest." Hargrove's voice came from the doorway, where he had been observing the exchange. "Perhaps you should return tomorrow." Florence turned to find the older man watching her with an expression that made her skin crawl. There was nothing of concern in his gaze, only calculation. "We'll stay in town tonight," Ethan said firmly, his arm now fully around Florence's shoulders. "We'll return in the morning." As they left the sick room, Hargrove followed them into the main part of the house. "There's a matter we should discuss before you go," he said, his tone suddenly businesslike. "Regarding the farm," Florence paused, turning to face him. "What about it?" "Your father owes me a considerable sum," Hargrove stated. "He borrowed against this property to cover his debts after last year's crop failed. As his only heir, those obligations will fall to you upon his passing." Ethan's expression hardened. "Do you have documentation of these loans?" Hargrove's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, all properly signed and witnessed." He withdrew several papers from a drawer in the sideboard. "The total comes to just over $2,000, a sum your father cannot possibly repay in his condition." Florence examined the documents, recognizing her father's signature on each. The dates coincided with the period just before her escape, around the time her father had first proposed the match with Hargrove. "So this is why he wanted me to marry you," she said quietly, "to settle his debts." "It would have been a practical arrangement," Hargrove agreed, his cold gaze traveling over her in a way that made Florence instinctively move closer to Ethan. "One that could still be advantageous, given your current situation." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Florence and Hargrove. "Miss Sinclair's situation is that she's engaged to be married to me. Any debts her father has will be handled legally through proper channels." Hargrove's expression soured. "The proper channel, Mr. Winters, would be for Miss Sinclair to honor her father's wishes and fulfill the agreement he made." "There was never any agreement on my part," Florence interjected, finding her voice. "And my father, even on his deathbed, acknowledged that he was wrong to try to force such an arrangement." "Sentimentality from a dying man," Hargrove scoffed. "The fact remains that without some arrangement you stand to lose everything: the farm, the house, your inheritance. Is that what you want?" Florence looked around at the house where she had spent her childhood, some parts of it happy, with her mother alive and her father still kind, but many more years of it miserable after her mother's passing. The place held more painful memories than pleasant ones. "What I want," she said clearly, "is to return to Willow Creek with my fiancé and build the life we've chosen together. This farm holds nothing for me now." Hargrove's face darkened. "You'll regret that decision when the bank forecloses and you're left with nothing from your family legacy." "Some legacies aren't worth preserving," Florence replied, surprised by her own certainty. "We'll return tomorrow to see my father. After that, Mr. Hargrove, I suggest you direct any further communications through Judge Barnes in Willow Creek, who will be handling my legal affairs." Without waiting for his response, Florence turned and walked out of the house that had once been her prison, Ethan close behind her. Only when they were mounted and riding away did she let out the breath she'd been holding. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked gently as they made their way toward the small town 2 miles distant. "Better than I expected," Florence admitted. "Seeing my father like that, so diminished, so near the end, I thought I would feel triumphant, or at least vindicated. Instead, I just feel sad for all the years we lost to his bitterness." Ethan reached across to take her hand. "You showed remarkable compassion back there. Many in your position wouldn't have offered forgiveness so readily." "It wasn't for him," Florence said thoughtfully. "It was for me." Carrying that anger and hurt was becoming its own kind of prison. She glanced back at the farm receding in the distance. "As for Hargrove and his claims on the property, let him have it. There's nothing there I want or need." "Are you certain?" Ethan asked. "That land is your birthright." Florence smiled, a genuine smile that lightened her heart. "My birthright is the life I choose to create, not the one chosen for me by others, and I've already made my choice." They spent the night at the town's small hotel and returned to the farm the following morning. Florence's father was weaker but still conscious, and they spent an hour with him, during which he spoke haltingly of Florence's mother and happier times. When they left, both knew it would be the last time Florence would see him alive. 3 days later, as they were preparing to depart for Willow Creek, word came that Calvin Sinclair had passed peacefully in his sleep. Florence attended the simple funeral, accepting condolences from neighbors who remembered her from childhood, most of whom expressed surprise and pleasure at her evident happiness with Ethan. Hargrove was conspicuously absent from the service, though Florence later learned he had wasted no time filing his claim against the estate. As predicted, the farm would be sold to satisfy her father's debts. Florence felt only relief as she and Ethan rode away for the final time, her past firmly behind her and her future bright ahead. They returned to Willow Creek a week before Christmas, greeted warmly by friends who had worried about their unexpected journey. The wedding preparations had continued in their absence, thanks to Mrs. Peterson's efficient management, and Florence threw herself back into the final details with renewed enthusiasm. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside the church windows, Florence Sinclair became Florence Winters in a ceremony attended by nearly every resident of Willow Creek. She wore a gown of ivory satin, lovingly created by the town's seamstress, and carried holly and winter berries instead of traditional flowers. When Ethan lifted her veil and looked into her eyes before sealing their vows with a kiss, Florence saw in his gaze all the promise of that first night's safety. Yes, but also respect, partnership, and a love that had grown from the seeds of compassion into something enduring and true. "I love you, Florence Winters," he whispered against her lips. "And I love you," she replied, her heart fuller than she had ever imagined possible, "for all the days to come." The reception at the Barnes home lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than the small town had seen at one gathering in years. As midnight approached, Ethan led his bride away from the celebration to the home. They would share a small house near both the school and the livery, which they had purchased together. Inside, a fire welcomed them, prepared earlier by Sam Jenkins as a wedding gift. Ethan lifted Florence across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. "Happy?" he asked, his arms still around her waist. "Beyond measure," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face, this man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness on a moonlit night. "When I ran from my father's house, I never imagined I was running toward something so wonderful. That night when I heard gunshots and found you in that ravine," Ethan said softly, "something told me my life would never be the same. I just didn't know how completely you would transform it." As snow continued to fall outside their windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, Florence and Ethan began their life together, not as a woman fleeing danger and a cowboy offering temporary shelter, but as equal partners in a journey neither could have envisioned that fateful night on the Kansas prairie. In the years that followed, Willow Creek flourished, as did the Winters family. Florence continued teaching until the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Ethan's sister. 2 years later, a son joined their family, followed by another daughter the year after that. The railroad came through as predicted, bringing growth and prosperity to the town. Ethan's livery expanded into a successful ranch operation where he raised and trained some of the finest horses in the territory. Florence eventually returned to teaching part-time as her children grew, and later helped establish a proper library for Willow Creek. Sometimes on summer evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch their children play in the yard, marveling at the life they had built together from such unlikely beginnings. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked once as they celebrated 10 years of marriage. Leaving everything behind that night, Florence looked at their home, their children, and finally at the man who had kept his promise to keep her safe and had given her so much more than safety. "Not for a single moment," she replied, taking his hand in hers. "That night, I wasn't just running away from something. Though I didn't know it then, I was running toward everything I ever wanted." Ethan squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the same love that had guided them from strangers to soulmates. "Then I'm glad I was there to help you find your way." "Not just to help me find my way," Florence corrected gently, "to find our way together." And as the sun set on another day in the life they had chosen, Florence Winters knew with absolute certainty that the frightened young woman who had fled her father's tyranny had found not just escape, but the true meaning of home in a town called Willow Creek, and in the arms of a cowboy who had promised forever, and with each passing day continued to keep that promise.